Are you ready to revolutionize your relationship with money? Welcome to the Finding Financial Freedom podcast with the Frugal Physician, where Dr. Disha Spath will be your companion on this exciting financial adventure. Get ready to conquer debt, build wealth, and embrace a mindful spending lifestyle that will empower you to live life on your own terms.
Pearson Ravitz' story begins with Dr. Stephanie Pearson, a passionate OB-GYN at the height of her career. But then, a shoulder injury struck during a precipitous delivery. Her dreams were shattered, leaving her unable to practice medicine. Determined to make a difference, Stephanie became an advocate for her peers, guiding them through the complex disability process. Alongside insurance expert Scott Ravitz, Stephanie founded Pearson Ravitz, a company determined to approach insurance differently. Together, they set their mission to educate and empower physicians to protect their most valuable asset, their income, and the most important people in their life, their family. Today, Pearson Ravitz serves the medical community in all 50 states. At Pearson Ravitz, they understand the unique concerns of physicians. Physician-founded and physician-focused, Pearson Ravitz builds human connections before they create quotes. Life can change in an instant. It's hard to imagine that a sudden illness or injury could leave you and your family in a devastating financial situation. But with a little planning and guidance, you can prepare for every possibility. Visit PearsonRavitz.com to schedule your consultation with a Pearson Ravitz advisor. Hello, friends. It's Dr. Disha Spath here, and welcome to another episode of Finding Financial Freedom with the Frugal Physician. Today, I'm excited to bring you a special treat, a re-release of my guest appearance on the Earn and Invest podcast hosted by the amazing Doc G. I really like this conversation because we talked about a lot of charged topics, and I hope you think we did it in a fair way. We get into the intricate world of financial freedom, discussing how current political climate might impact our personal finances. We also explore the importance of long-term financial planning, the potential effects of legislative changes, and how to stay resilient in uncertain times. I'm Dr. Disha Spath, and this is the Earn and Invest podcast.
The world is ending, or at least that is what they are telling us. The left says it's a choice between democracy and authoritarianism. The right says it's a choice between freedom and socialism. Most of us just want to live a life in a safe country where we have a reasonable shot at personal and financial freedom. Let's talk about financial freedom. We have lived through economic booms and busts. We have survived Y2K, the Great Recession, COVID, and the Great Resignation. Yet, this current presidential election feels different. Today is July 22nd, the Monday after President Biden has announced he will not be running this year after all. The future seems tenuous. What happens next? Today's discussion is different than you usually hear on Earn and Invest. As opposed to an interview, it's more of a conversation. The point is not to express political views, but instead to discuss how our politics may or may not affect our financial lives. Joining me is fellow physician and podcaster Disha Spath. Dr. Disha Spath is a board-certified internal medicine doctor and founder and CEO of the Frugal Physician, a site focused on providing money-saving tips and discounts for healthcare professionals, as well as education on personal financial principles. She's a contributor to NBC Universal and has been featured on CNBC and Forbes. She is passionate about teaching basic finance principles to physicians so that they can find the freedom to create their ideal lives. Disha, welcome to Earn and Invest. As we come into this conversation, I'm thinking about a family member who in 2016 had decided that when Trump was elected, it was going to turn our world upside down. And she went to her 401k and literally put everything in cash. And she left it there for all 4 years, from 2016 to 2020. And while everyone else's 401k balances zoomed upwards, she went nowhere and then eventually got back in after he left office.
Wow.
Have you seen other people do this, make these kind of random decisions based on what's happening politically in the world? And in this case, she paid for it.
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. It's a true pleasure. I have heard of people doing this. I hope, I don't know of anyone particularly that has done this, but I can understand the sentiment and the fear of, completely different mindset coming into office. It is important to know that while stock markets will, go up and down and fluctuate during elections, especially during really contentious elections, generally the stock market doesn't have much to do with who's in the executive branch. And generally the stock market gets better after the election cycle. So it is important to keep that in mind. But yeah, I can understand that sentiment. It is important to understand, though, that fiscal decisions that we make as personal investors need to be focused on more of a long-term view of the market.
Yeah, and I think that's something we're going to repeat over and over again, especially when we're talking about the stock market. Short-term stock fluctuations have very little to do with the long-term economy. A lot of times they do have to deal with fear, anxiety, or jubilation, depending on what's happening in the world. But the long-term economy, like you said, often isn't related to who specifically is in office. However, that is much different from legislation. So we know, depending on who's not just president, but who's in Congress, legislation changes, and that legislation impacts things. Have you ever found yourself looking forward saying, okay, I think it's going to be a Republican Congress. They may change, for instance, how our 401ks are managed or how our IRAs are managed. So I better start changing things.
Yeah. So there are two different, perspectives of this. First of all, there's just the stock market, which kind of does its own thing and is based more on the company's performance and the public's opinion of them. But it's important to remember we have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And on top of that, we have the Fed, which is not directly controlled by the executive branch. And the Fed is tasked with, also keeping our economic stability going and limiting inflation. And they do that by manipulating the federal funds rate, open market transactions. So they're trying to regulate our monetary policy indirectly by being the bank of banks, right? While this election is very important for several reasons, but two major ones is the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is going to go out of business, is going to expire in 2025. Also, the student loan environment is incredibly dependent on who gets power next. And not only is the executive branch on the ballot, you also have the legislative branch on the ballot. You have a third of the Senate seats and all of the Congress seats on the ballot. A lot of how our country progresses is going to depend on who wins and then what kind of legislation they enact and execute.
And so we're not giving opinions here at the moment, but to make things clear, when it comes to the tax cuts, the Democrats generally want to allow them to expire, whereas the Republicans generally want to continue them. Democrats argue that those are tax cuts mainly for the rich, and the Republicans are saying, no, they actually stimulate the economy and are helping the middle class and the poor. When it comes to student loans, Democrats tend to be more for forgiveness. And during the Biden administration, there was much more for forgiveness, whereas Republicans generally aren't. How much do you think people are voting on these financial issues? So do you think people are heading to the polls and saying, I hear everything going on. Maybe I don't even, for instance, like the Democrats, but I really would love to get rid of my student loans, so I'm going to vote for them. Or the other way around, maybe I'm not a big fan of the Republicans, but I think these tax cuts are good for America. And so this is my main issue. Do you think people are becoming kind of a one issue voter, or specifically financial voters?
I think there's a subset of the population that is generally a financial voter. And it's interesting how the finances affect the two different sides differently. People with a lot of student loans would obviously, if they were voting financially, would want to keep a student loan friendly government in office. But people without student loans, people that are more small business owners, would definitely benefit from an extension of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. So I think even financial voters would be split based on what's on the ballot. But of course, social issues also are driving this election. The major issue in this election, women's rights, is in the spotlight. And the two parties obviously differ very frankly on that. So I think we have a little bit of finance and social issue playing into this election.
And it's interesting, right? Because when we talk about social issues, let's talk about gender issues or DEI issues. I had John Hope Bryant on the podcast not that long ago, and he would argue that the social issues are the financial issues. He'd say, look, we do not have enough workers in this economy. We do not have enough business owners. No matter how many quote unquote white men there are available, they are not going to be able to fulfill the need. And so he'll tell you the social issue is a financial issue because he says we need women in the workplace. We need people of color in the workplace. We need them starting their own businesses. We need them to drive the economy. So it's interesting because there's such an overlap with both the social and financial issues. It's sometimes hard to separate them.
Right. I think your perspective on how integrated the social issues are into the financial issues also depends on who you're supporting. The admission that you need people other than white people and women in the marketplace is a truly democratic concept, I think. So the Republican Party focuses more on taxing people less, corporate tax rate cuts. And so that is more of the older concept of just people with money having more money will make the economy better. I think that the social and the financial definitely are tied together, but admission of that relation is more divided along party lines.
Do you think the contrast is as stark as we're making it out to be? I mean, I often say elections have consequences. On the other hand, people would say, look, there's been a trajectory of our economy, there's been a trajectory of our legislation, and it far outlives one president or another. How stark is the contrast? Are these really two different visions economically of how the US should be?
I think so. I mean, the Trump agenda is a whole different view. And you could argue whether Project 2025 is related to the Trump campaign or not. This is a completely different view of our economy than has been instituted in the past. I think especially in this election, a lot is on the ballot and your vote really does count. Whereas the Republican Party is focused on cutting taxes and helping corporations. The Democratic Party is more focused on student loan debt relief, perhaps taxing corporations more. Biden introduced a minimum across the board tax rate for everyone and increasing the corporate tax rate. So we don't know who the Republicans are going to be running against at this point, which is an interesting concept. Harris is backed by Biden, but we don't know if she is going to be actually nominated by the Democratic Party until August. There could be challengers. So we don't exactly know who Trump's opponent's going to be, but we do know where the Democrats stand on a lot of these issues as a party. So we can continue to, make our projections that way. I think the important thing to know for personal investors is that, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is going to be on the ballot, basically. If the Democrats get elected in the executive branch, they're most likely not going to advocate for the continuation of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act for people making more than $400,000 a year. That's what Biden had proposed initially. So a lot of those tax cuts, the increase in the standard deduction may expire for people making more than $400,000 a year. And then, of course, the student loan atmosphere is huge right now. Biden put forward the SAVE plan, largely by executive action. It's not written into the promissory note, but it humongously decreases the monthly payments for people with student loans, but it's recently been challenged in the courts. So we've had 2 states that challenged it, and now the Court of Appeals has put a pause on the SAVE plan indefinitely until we figure out what's going to happen to it. And now it's going to go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is largely conservative at this point, so it may not survive. So the student loan relief environment is on this ballot, right? So we really need to pay attention. Unfortunately, we don't have too much control over the Supreme Court right now, and we'll just have to see how the SAFE plan plays out. But Trump has proposed that he would get rid of all of the IDR plans except for one, keep one around with the payment capped at 12.5% gross adjusted income. So That's much higher than the SAVE plan, which is 5 to 10%. So anyway, the payments on these for people with student loans, the payments would most likely go up, and a lot of the forgiveness may be going away, especially the tax-free forgiveness. So the IDR plan recently has been tax-free thanks to the COVID provisions, but in 2025, that's going to expire. The forgiveness with just the income-driven plans is going to be taxable after 2025 as the law currently stands. So whether the government extends that tax-free forgiveness or not is also on the ballot. So there's a lot to be concerned about.
So time waits for no one. And there are a lot of people who, even if you had none of this going on, were in the midst of making their financial moves, right? Some people are talking about retiring this year. Some people are talking about maybe finally kicking those student loans. How do we decide whether to take action now or not? And do we change this because of what's happening in the chaos that's going on? So for instance, if I was planning on retiring this year, should I put it off another year to see what happens with the election? Could this be a particularly bad time to retire because maybe the chaos with the election will cause the stock market to fall and I'll run into sequence of returns risk? How do we both not become victims of analysis paralysis and do nothing when we should be kind of doing these good money moves, and yet also not react to the hyper acute news and get ourselves in trouble?
Yeah, so that's always the challenge, right? I think generally a long-term view of the market is a wise perspective to have. To realize that stocks will go up and down during the election, but will revert back to the mean once the election has passed. So I wouldn't change my asset allocation drastically during this time. Based on the election, and if it was based on my long-term goals, then fine. One thing to keep in mind is the Fed, right? We know that the inflation was high during the post-pandemic phase. During 2021, we were up to 9%, right? This consumer price index was up to 9%. Now we're back down to 3%. We know that the Federal Reserve is aiming for a 2% inflation rate. So while they did not decrease the federal funds rate this cycle, they might do that in September. So the interest rates or the yield on bonds may be going down, right? Especially the short-term bonds have really benefited from the high interest rates set by the Fed. So the bond rate may be going down. So this may be a time to think about locking into longer-term bonds, right? Instead of shorter term bonds, because those shorter term bonds are most likely going to go down in their interest rate. If you are planning on retiring soon, locking into longer term bonds for a more fixed income portfolio might be wise. That might be a good move to make. But otherwise, I would not take all of my money out of the stock market. Generally, fear-based decisions are not a good idea.
And as you mentioned, the Fed is really independent of what's happening politically, but inflation isn't, right? So decisions made by whoever's in power at the time can affect eventual inflation, but the Fed is pretty independent.
Right. And we know more or less where the Fed is leaning and when they meet and what the inflation rate is. So we can try to project out some decisions based on that. But otherwise, stick to a long-term strategy, and that is generally the wiser decision. Now, sequence of returns risk, like I said, most election cycles will wreak some havoc on the stock market. And most of that is based on speculations. While it might go up and down, you need to have that solid indestructibility in your mindset to just weather that out and believe that the fundamentals will survive. And our companies that are working hard to make us money will continue to do so.
Let's take a look at the alarmist position. I mean, some people looked, for instance, at January 6th, and if you were a certain political mindset, this was a major transgression in U.S. laws and U.S. norms, and are looking with a lot of fear towards this election and the changes that may come about. Is there any wisdom in having some money outside of the U.S. system? I mean, I could see someone saying things feel really unstable here. Maybe I'm someone who worries that my rights may not be what they were before. Is there any idea that maybe having some money outside the US is reasonable as a hedge, may protect you?
Do you mean like in a Swiss bank account, or do you mean in an international fund?
I think both. But what I was asking about specifically was something like a Swiss bank account, something that's not part of the US system.
That's an interesting question. I think that really depends on where you think the market's going to go. I personally have not divested any of my my assets
Yeah,
into a Swiss
I
bank
haven't either.
account.
Yeah, no, I haven't either. I'm just wondering, I could see someone saying, I'm worried about the overall stability of our government, especially someone who particularly was alarmed, let's say, by January 6th, right? So we're talking about very much one side of this political spectrum.
Yeah.
Maybe this is also the group of people really interested in cryptocurrency, right? There have been people forever who are interested in cryptocurrency because it is disconnected from the US financial system and it feels safe because of that.
Yeah.
I do wonder if there will be a group of people who are like, I'm definitely going to divest some of my assets outside of the US system just in case.
Yeah, I could see that, especially the super rich. I would make sure that you have some international exposure in your stock and bond allocation. Generally, that's recommended for portfolio design anyway. And if there are, ups and downs in our market and there are gains in the international market, which there haven't been recently, the international funds have not been performing that well, but that doesn't mean they won't perform well in the future. I think that would be a wise move, whether to take the money outside of the country or into cryptocurrency for those reasons. There are many different facets of that decision, but crypto, for example, has not really been regulated well yet in any country and has been incredibly volatile. So while it's a good place to put some fund money, in my opinion, I'm not sure I would put all the assets that I depend on in crypto for that reason.
We are talking to Dr. Disha Spath. She's a board-certified internal medicine doctor and founder and CEO of the Frugal Physician. And we are talking about the chaos of an election year, the stark contrast in the vision of what America will be, and specifically how we deal with our finances during this time. We're going to take a short break. I'm Doc G, and this is the Earn and Invest podcast. We are back with Dr. Disha Spath. She is the Frugal Physician. Her site is focused on providing money and savings tips and discounts for healthcare professionals, as well as an education on personal financial principles. And we are talking about the upcoming election and what it means to our personal finances. Disha, before the break, you went into some real specifics. Let's talk about overall how we feel about this. First and foremost, are you optimistic when you look at things? And really, a lot of this is out of our control. We can go and we can vote, but ultimately, there's going to be a lot of winners and a lot of losers. Regardless of what side you are on, do you think we should be optimistic about what's going to happen in the future?
Absolutely. I think we just went through an incredible upheaval worldwide with the COVID pandemic, not something we've seen in a very long time. And we have survived it in a fantastic fashion. The U.S. economy is doing fantastically, even though, the general public sentiment doesn't always agree with that. But inflation is down. Our stock market is doing well, despite all of that. And it has really shown me that our systems work. The central bank, the Fed, the fiscal policy by the executive branch, the Congress, as dysfunctional as it is, has passed budgets. The Supreme Court, as conservative as it is, has done its job, right? So I think I see our system working during this process. Our companies have done well. They have grown. Tech sector has done great. And so I have no reason to assume things are going to go south immediately. Now, if this election results in significant upheaval of everything we know as American, in that case, I'm not sure, but I will tell you that during the Trump administration, the markets also did okay. So they did well, in fact. So I am overall optimistic. Either way, I think who gets in power is going to affect different people differently, though, depending on whether you have student loans, whether you have a small business, how much money you make, how the Tax Cut and Jobs Act affects you, whether the Affordable Care Act is going to continue to exist, and how healthcare costs affect you. I think individually, this is going to be different for everyone.
Forget the burdens of tenants and toilets. Equity Multiple simplifies your investment journey, letting you invest passively in vetted, professionally managed commercial real estate. Only 5% of reviewed investments reach Equity Multiple's platform, with our asset management working on each from funding through exit to maximize your returns. Whether you're on the couch in your exec chair or the backseat of a ride share, Equity Multiple brings cash-flowing real estate investments straight to your fingertips. All investments involve risk. Visit equitymultiple.com to learn more.
It strikes me as interesting. If we homogenize the political differences and just say we had COVID and then we had Trump and then Biden, and if we look at them as one person and we look at their actions together, and you see the US, you would say the US has come out of this pandemic by far better than most countries.
Yes.
The US has survived economically. When you look at today's economic numbers, joblessness is down, wages are up, more people have healthcare than they've ever had before. I mean, the economic indicators are better. Inflation is going down. Generally, one could look at our world and say, hey, we're not giving credit for any one person or one party, but when you look at how the US handled together during both their administrations, we seem to be in a pretty good place, and yet many people don't feel in a good place.
Yes.
Why do you think that is? Because it's a disconnect. I'm always scratching my head over the difference between what the numbers seem to say and then what the person on the ground feels. And the reason why I ask that question is does it relate to the different visions of America that both parties are pushing?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the information the person is consuming and how available certain facts are to them. But also, the cost of shelter has not come down all that much. And that's what is keeping the inflation rate a little bit higher than our goal. The housing costs are still high, and the borrowing rate is still high for consumers. So, a lot of people are putting off major financial and lifestyle decisions because of the current economy and the current decisions that the Fed's making. So I think for those reasons, where do I live? How much does my mortgage cost me? That's still high. So I think that affects consumers directly. Also, the cost of goods. While the consumer price index has improved, people will often quote the price of a dozen eggs or the prices at the supermarket, right? So, and a lot of those costs went up significantly during COVID and have not come down all that much. And those costs are not directly controlled by the executive branch, right? So they're controlled by the companies as well, who may not be willing to cut their profits just yet. So the average consumer is not looking at their 401k returns. They're looking at how much they're spending at the grocery store. So I think that may be some part of the actual disconnect.
I wonder if it's a fair question. Politicians love to ask you a question. They say, well, are you better than you were 4 years ago? Are you better off? Are things better? But in a sense, what we seem to be saying is, I don't know if it's necessarily related per se to who's in office. Is it a fair question? I mean, should we be asking that? I know right now the Republicans are saying, people in the United States, ask yourself, are you better than you were 4 years ago? And I know the Democrats were doing the same thing during the 2020 election, as they're asking Republicans and saying, are you better than you were, 4 years ago? Is it connected?
That's a good question. And right now, that question is so skewed by the fact that we had the COVID pandemic 4 years ago. In 2020, we were all shut down and in fear of our lives, right? Well, I think that's an easy question right now. So I think it depends on where you start the clock, whether you start the clock at the Max Trump years, right before the pandemic, or whether you started at the beginning of the pandemic. But like you said, it may not be actually related to who's in power, right? And especially in this case, this was related to a worldwide pandemic that we did not have control over. while we have made it through the pandemic really well based on the policies, the fiscal and the monetary policies that have been instituted, I think credit needs to be given to the Biden administration for getting us out of that. And I don't think they're given enough credit for all that they did to get us out of that. But, Trump also helped the economy a lot by decreasing the tax rates on individuals and decreasing the tax rate on corporations. I think it goes both ways. And like I said, the administrations affect different sectors differently, different groups of people differently. And I think that's why we have the vote, right? So that we can vote on our interests.
So let's talk about solutions. Obviously, one, as you were just saying, is go out, vote, let your voice be heard. But let's talk about what we can do financially. Your moniker is the frugal physician. Let's talk about frugality. That seems to be something we can control. Is that a superpower, especially in these kind of unknown future that's coming?
Absolutely. I think having savings, having a delta between income and expenses is a superpower. Most Americans are not able to afford a $1,000 emergency. And to be able to if there is upheaval, if for some reason you lose your job, if for some reason this election causes you to not have income for 3 months, being able to survive that without having to take all of your money out of the stock market really sets you up for success, because the short-term variability in the stock market will happen. Your ability to survive is based on your resiliency, your personal resiliency, not only mentally, but also fiscally. And a lot of that is based on your savings rate, right? And how well you save money, how well you spend money, especially in this environment where costs are high, grocery costs are high. Being able to be frugal, being able to compare prices, it can definitely be a superpower.
Disha, any tendency towards being a prepper? So, right, when we worry about natural disasters, you have the people who are hoarding the water and they have their little bunker in the canned foods. Anything we can do to kind of protect ourselves on a more kind of physical level like that?
I haven't gone to the point of
You don't have a bunker?
prepping. I don't have a bunker.
You don't have a bunker? Come on.
I don't personally think that's super necessary. To be able to prep food for the week, I think, is a superpower, and not eating out. But no, I'm not hoarding rations or anything like that. And I don't think it hurts if you want to do it, but I don't think it's 100% necessary.
A little bit less of an extreme version of this is I hear a lot of people deciding that they want to put some money in gold because they think magically that gold is going to be a more stable asset with whatever kind of chaos could be hitting us. Is there any truth to that? I mean, I see this all the time. It's like, oh, things are uncertain. I want to make sure I have a certain amount of gold. Is that reasonable?
I think gold always comes into the conversation when the economy is somewhat unpredictable. I don't know if it has actually performed better, though, than the stock market. I know it hasn't. The stock market generally brings better returns. Equities bring better returns over time. But if it provides some peace of mind, then I guess that's okay. But you're not getting fantastic results from that generally.
Yeah, I always hear people talk about gold as it tends to keep up with an inflation, right? See, the amount of gold that would buy a nice suit back in 1900 is, it's still about the same amount of gold that'll buy a nice suit today, and nothing much has changed. So overall, thumbnail sketch, it sounds like at this point, we should pay attention, listen, but maybe not change anything major in our asset allocations or what we're doing for the time being. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I think long-term view is very important here. This is just an election. It's an important election, and you should certainly pay attention and think about how the candidates and the vote that you're casting will affect your life in the future. I think the issues here on the ballot are big, to say the least, and will affect different segments of the population drastically. However, personal finance principles, investing principles stay the same. And I think asset allocation and your general spending plan should be based on your long-term goals, and try not to react to the short-term situation other than what we know with good certainty, like the federal funds rate.
Yeah, I hate to say it, but I think it also rings true that mostly the kind of people listening to this podcast, the kind of people who are worried about the asset allocation, mostly the turmoil doesn't affect the upper middle and upper class nearly as much, or upper middle and upper income as much.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, a lot of times the people who are really going to be affected by this are the people who are marginally surviving at the moment.
Right.
And so for those of us who are doing fairly well and have an asset allocation and pay attention to stocks and bonds and these kind of things, most likely legislation tends to support those people over long term, whether we want to admit it or not.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, the people who really majorly can get affected by these type of elections are the people who are living on the cusp right now. Their lives could either be a lot better or a lot worse.
Yes.
Maybe not necessarily those of us who are paying as much attention to this and are worried about our financial assets.
Right. I agree. And I do think it's, how much the student loan situation affects young borrowers, the housing market right now, young borrowers and people that are living on the edge are significantly affected by this policy. So that's why it's very, very important for everyone to get out there and vote and cast a ballot based on your needs.
Well, Disha, I wanted to thank you for coming on the show today. As I really think about our conversation, I realize that, yes, this is a very consequential election, and I think all of our voices should be heard. But sometimes it's more about the long-term consequences. In the short term, our financial lives probably won't change very much. But in the long term, our lives in general could, and that's why it's important that we stay involved and engaged, but we can probably worry slightly less about what's going to happen to our money today, tomorrow, or even next year. I want to end this episode the way I end every episode by asking you what is up next in your life and where people can find you. First and foremost, tell everybody about your podcast.
Yes, thank you. I host a podcast called Finding Financial Freedom with the Frugal Physician, and I would love for you to join us. We talk about lifestyle, we talk about spending, we talk about investing, and we generally have a lot of fun talking about value-based decisions and how we can make our lives better with better financial management.
And what is the best way to get in touch with you if people have questions or want to know more about your platform?
Absolutely. You can message me on my website, www.thefrugalphysician.com, or I'm available on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Haven't quite made it onto TikTok yet, but you can reach me at thefrugalphysician@gmail.com as well.
Dr. Disha Spath, thank you so much for coming on and having this difficult conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. I think it's always fun to discuss politics and haven't had the opportunity to do so much yet. And I really appreciate that.
That's a wrap. Earn and Invest is now part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to this show as well as other fine podcasts. Admittedly, this episode was a little bit out of character. Let's talk about why. First and foremost, I am not a political expert. Dr. Disha Spath is not a political expert. We don't study politics. We think a lot about finances. So ultimately, we're having a conversation about things we are not expert in. And as you know, at the Earn and Invest podcast, we generally have experts to talk about their field of study. So first and foremost, this was atypical because we had two non-experts talking about politics. On the other hand, this is something that's affecting all of our lives, and we are experts in personal finance. And so while the politics is not something we spend a huge amount of time studying, we do know what it's like to try to make financial decisions in the midst of a whirlwind, in the midst of uncertainty. And I think that's what all of us are undergoing right now. I think that's what all of us are going through right now. We are living in a moment of uncertainty. How big is this moment? I have no idea. I have no idea if in 10 years we'll look back and say, oh, that was no big deal. Or if in 10 years we'll look back and say that is when the world changed. I don't think any of us know that. But all of us have to confront this idea of what do we do with our pocketbooks? What do we do with our investments? How do we plan for the future? And most importantly, how do we risk mitigate? Because a lot of you listening right now are in a pretty good financial situation. You might be financially independent, you might not, but at least you understand your finances. You have an asset allocation. You're working towards a better financial situation. And so it's not accumulation you're going to struggle with. It's risk mitigation. How are you going to make sure that you hold on to your wealth and use it to support you for the rest of your life? What happens in this presidential election is consequential, regardless of which side you believe has it right. There is real policy at stake here. There are real decisions both financially and socially. Not voting is not even a possibility, but more importantly, it's key that the vote we cast actually reflects our values, both financially and otherwise. And so that's why I wanted to have this conversation today, and specifically so that people don't go out and make dumb decisions and change their asset allocation and try to react to something that they probably have no idea what the outcome will be. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't financially plan for the future, and knowing the politics of the day and what future legislation could look like can affect how you long-term invest. But the other side of that is the short term. You don't want to go making any drastic choices right now. You don't want to be the person who decides that you hate who is elected president, so you're going to pull all your money out of the market, because time and time again, people are burned by these tactics. Regardless of who becomes president, at least in the short term, the stock market's going to be fine. Even in the midterm, what we're really arguing about here is the long-term future of our country, our money, and ourselves. And I think that's where we have to draw the line. So I wouldn't make any quick changes because probably not much is going to be different in 6 months from today than it is today. But we have to keep our eye on the long-term prize. How do we risk mitigate? What is our country going to look like in 10, 15, 20, 30 years when we're retired and have no income and have to think about our financial safety and security? That's what this election is really about. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation with Disha, because I felt like we needed to be two regular people having a conversation about the future and the unknown, and what we can do to protect ourselves. I don't have any of the answers. I tried to keep the conversation less political. I know that's impossible. Everyone has a viewpoint. Everyone has a party they follow. Everyone has an ethos they live by. So we couldn't make this conversation completely non-political. But my goal was that it would be at least less political so we could focus more on the ideas of, regardless of who you support, how your life may or may not change. A lot of uncertainty in the future. That doesn't necessarily mean bad change. It just means hold on tight. Don't change your asset allocation for a short-term swing in fear, anxiety, stress, whatever. And let's do what we always do, which is hope for the best. All right, I leave things running just for a few minutes to catch whatever our after show. Again, thank you for being willing to have this complicated and difficult conversation. Do you think there's anything we really left out? Anything that we want to make sure people know before we sign off?
Let me just scroll through my notes here. I don't think so. I think we covered most of it. I went on a ramble in the middle there.
No, you didn't go on any rambles at all. And actually, like I said, what was wonderful is I think we hear the words, we hear the names of the laws, but a lot of times we don't understand necessarily the details. So it was nice that you knew and had a lot of those details. This is a tough one because I do think this is a very consequential election. On the other hand, I think it's probably more consequential for non-economic reasons than economic ones.
Yes.
because of the momentum of the American economy, it's really hard for one political party or the other to really ruin us financially.
Right.
Our systems, thankfully, protect against that. And the fact is, the economy goes down, people get upset with the current political party, and they hire a new political party that has opposed ideas. So eventually it tends to kind of, homogenize itself out. But I do think there are real social consequences. And,
Right.
we have these times like, the passages of the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s was one of those times. Right around the Civil War was one of those times. The question is, are we at that big of a time, or are we at what seems very important, but we'll look back in the future and say, oh, everything was fine. And that we don't know. We don't have that hindsight yet.
Right. I think fiscally, we're probably at that, the second where, everything's probably going to be fine. But socially, I agree with you. I think this is a big moment where people will decide what our country looks like in the future socially, and I hope people will get out and vote and express, their interests. Definitely as a woman, it's an important time.
Yeah. And part of it, too, is there's been a lot of data out there about this idea of whether people vote for the specific candidate or it really depends on what's happening in the world and which platform people believe in.
Right.
There's all the study about the 13 keys, the guy who kind of uses these keys to guess who's going to be, the next president. He's been right pretty much every time for the last 40 years. And the idea is it's not necessarily the person, it's more the milieu, the environment of what's happening in the world when it happens. So you wonder too how much it is these specific personalities versus these are the trends going on in the world right now. And so people are more likely to vote either conservative or liberal based on what world trends are happening at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I just hope, my fear is that, the vote will not be honored. And there will be violence, right? I think if there is violence, like the January 6th, that our systems kicked in. In January 6th, those people weren't organized very well, though. I mean, they're basically in the Capitol taking selfies. They might be better armed this time. But hopefully our institutions, and survive, and the people that are protecting us will continue to do so. And I think they will. And I do have confidence that will happen. There might be some unrest. There might be some violence if things don't go to Trump, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, we will keep our fingers crossed and hopefully it will turn out okay.
And that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed this special episode from the Earn and Invest podcast as much as I did. A big thank you to Doc G for proposing this topic and letting me talk about politics without being too political. Remember, no matter what the political landscape looks like, staying informed and making smart decisions based on what's going on the ground, as well as your long-term financial goals, is key to achieving financial freedom. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with your friends and colleagues. Don't forget to subscribe to Finding Financial Freedom with the Frugal Physician for more tips and strategies on living a financially savvy life. As always, you can reach me at my website, thefrugalphysician.com, or connect with me on social media. Stay frugal, stay informed, and keep striving for financial freedom. Until next time, stay frugal, y'all. Now, a final word from our sponsor. At Pearson Rabbits, they understand that life can change in an instant. It's hard to imagine that a sudden illness, injury, or catastrophic event could put you and your family in a devastating financial situation. Physician-founded and physician-focused, Pearson Rabbits builds human connections before they create quotes. Visit www.pearsonrabbits.com today and embark on your journey to safeguarding your future.
The content shared on this podcast should not be taken as individualized financial advice. We are here to share our knowledge and experiences, but it is crucial to consult with professionals such as accountants, financial advisors, or attorneys who can provide personalized guidance based on your specific needs.